What are we going to be doing? Our agenda for today. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about what is theory building from cases, then take a look at when you might want to use this method and when you don't want to use this method. Something, and probably most of the conversation will be about how to implement theory building from cases. That is, what do you do? And then the last part will be a mix of topics, but certainly taking a look at least how I perceive what's rigor and what's quality, because I think there's some debate in the field about exactly what that is. So that's where we're going. So let's get started on what is theory building from cases. That's TBCS. Up there is theory building from case studies. First of all, theory building. Theory building means inductive. It means what we're doing, particularly in this method, is going from data to some sort of theory. So in effect, we're grounded theory. A key point is that the aim is theory. It's a simple point, in some ways an obvious point, but it's a point that's often missed. But the aim is theory. The aim is identifying constructs, identifying relationships or propositions between those constructs, and having underlying theoretical arguments of those propositions. So it's about constructs, it's about propositions, it's about theoretical arguments, about some sort of phenomenon that's of interest to you. It could be conflict in groups, it could be alliances, it could be sustainability, whatever. Another point that's often, I think, misunderstood, but I think is an important one, is the alternative methods to theory building from cases are formal models, so analytic math models, or armchair theorizing. So sitting in your office and thinking about what the theory might be. So that, and I think this is often a missed point. People think that, people misperceive that theory building, that the alternative method is somehow deductive research, and it's not. Deductive research and inductive research have two different aims. In theory building is about building a theory, obviously, and the alternative methods and the appropriate comparison is with some things like formal modeling and armchair theorizing. It's not deductive econometrics. The second, I think, definitional point is what's a case. A case is typically a rich empirical description of an example or an illustration of some sort of phenomenon, usually based in multiple data sources. So it's usually multiple data sources, not always, but usually, and it's a rich empirical description of a particular instance of a phenomenon. The other important thing about understanding what a case is that one analyzes a case in what's known as replication logic. That means when you're doing this kind of a method, you're looking case by case by case, rather than what's known as pooled logic, which is what deductive econometric researchers use, which means you pull things together, you have a sample that has a mean, that has a variance. You never talk about in case studies having a mean across the cases, because that's pooling it. Rather, you're looking at each case as its own independent entity. Within a case, it can be an embedded design, so you might have a design that's at one level about an organization, so organization 1, 2, 3, and then within that, it might be, for example, analyzing the embedded analysis might be just groups. Final point is not all qualitative research is multi-case theory building, and not all, so basically that point. Okay, that's the background of what multi-case theory building is. What are complements? What are the complementary methods? I think there's another kind of interesting and I'm perhaps overlooked point, is that multi-case or theory building from case studies is complementary to other kinds of methods. For example, the traditional econometric deductive theory testing. Some work by Ben Hallen, who's now at the University of Washington, I think illustrates this. Ben, before he came into academics, had been an entrepreneur who experienced trouble raising money. And so when he got to graduate school, he was interested in understanding how the non-elite form ties. So how, in particular, how do entrepreneurs form ties, particularly entrepreneurs who are first time, who are not particularly anybody, it's not like Elon Musk forming a tie. It's sort of a nobody like you and me. How do those people form ties? What he did was did a case study of 12 ventures trying to form ties, and got some insights about how these less privileged entrepreneurs form ties, and contrasted that with what elite entrepreneurs do. So elite entrepreneurs follow social network theory. They go to their friends and get money. Lower status entrepreneurs use other tactics. What he saw that dynamic in cases, but then was able to test that dynamic in econometrically. So show, for example, that lower status entrepreneurs take longer to form ties, they form them in a different way, and so on. Interestingly, the order in which the articles were published was not the same order of how he actually did the work. He actually published the econometric paper first, the 2008 piece, and then published the 2012 piece, which was the case study. But actually, it was the other way around. The cases came before the econometrics. Another example of a complement is in simulation. Some of you may know I've done some work on simple rules. For example, Chris Bingham and I did a paper on how do entrepreneurs find simple rules and what's the value of simple rules. We saw that from cases, but we also, with Jason Davis, did a simulation of simple rules. And what we were able to do was take the basic ideas of what simple rules do and optimal structure, and then simulate that and experiment in a way that you couldn't do in real life on different kinds of market conditions. For example, uncertainty, ambiguity, complexity. So theory building from case studies provided the base theory for then experimenting with different kinds of markets. So that's a second example of complements. Another complement is formal models, where case study might reveal some mechanisms, and then a formal modeler like Connie Helfat or Tim Folta or Arkady Sarkatov then take the insights from the cases, a particular insight, usually a fairly narrow insight, and then unpack that again in ways that you couldn't do empirically. Excuse me, in a case study. More recently, it's not on the slide, but I've also been using machine learning with case studies, because I think that's a pretty interesting comparison. Excuse me. So that's some ideas about complements. Everybody good so far? Checking the, yeah, it looks that way. Okay. Go to the next. Ideas.
Kathleen, there's a question in the chat. Maybe this is a good point to ask it. Seham is asking, how about single case study?
I'll get to that. Yeah, so I'm more of a multi-case study, but the comments that I just made relate to single cases too. And then I'll talk more about what I think the comparison between those two is a little later. Okay, when do you use what? We're good? Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. When do you actually use theory building from case studies? You use it in a couple of different situations. You use it when there's little or no theory. So to give you an example, Melissa Graebner's study of acquisition, what she did was she looked at the M&A literature. And by the way, I'm a strategy org theory person, so you're going to hear a lot of macro examples today, but obviously it fits for micro topics as well. But to go back to Melissa, she looked at acquisition, and in order to do the study, she both did a literature review of M&A, as well as she'd worked in industry and seen her friends having startups and selling them. And what she realized as she looked at the literature was probably 95%, if not more, of the acquisition literature is from the point of view of the buyer, as if the seller doesn't matter at all. And so what she did, there was really no theory about what do acquisitions look like from the seller point of view. Sam Garg, in his study of boards, did the same thing. He looked at the board's literature and saw that it is virtually always from the point of view of the board or the owner, and not from the point of view of CEOs. So he turned it around and started thinking about, well, how do CEOs actually manage their board? So both of those are examples of where there was little or no theory, particularly from the perspective that both Melissa and Sam used for their studies. Another situation you might use theory building from cases is problematic theory. For example, Pinar Ozkan's study of entrepreneurs building alliance portfolios in the mobile gaming industry. When she looked at alliance formation, she realized that literature is coming out of organization theory, much of it, and it's very deterministic. The idea is that I form ties with whom I already have direct ties with, who my friends have direct ties with, or with whom I'm homophilous. So it's very much a deterministic view as opposed to an agentic view of an entrepreneur or an executive making choices. It also assumes that firms already exist, so they have a track record, and that the market exists. but so the theory that existed didn't really fit how an entrepreneur would build an alliance portfolio in a new market. So there just wasn't a theory to talk about if you didn't have prior ties, if a market didn't exist. Jeff Martin's work on multi-business firms creating synergy was another example where the prior work was limited. This was, if you read this work, you would see that it was econometrics based, the prior work, and it made assumptions about organizations that, if you knew organizations, didn't seem realistic. And then when you actually looked at the results were extremely weak. So it was basically the results. If you get your sample large enough, you can have a statistically significant result that's sort of practically trivial if your sample's big enough. And so that's what this literature looked like, was this whole bunch of really weak results. It just didn't seem very, very plausible. And so it was a situation where the existing theory didn't seem very effective. Another example where you might use it is, again, kind of where you don't really know what's going on. And this is something Chris Bingham and I did. Chris noticed that the learning literature is primarily about variations on the kind of experience that you have and some prediction of performance. So it might be you have lots of experience or experiments with a particular time sequence to it, or whatever it is, but something about experience driving performance was largely what the learning literature was about. But what that literature never looked at is what were people learning. So there was this whole literature about learning, but no one was looking inside the black box of the process that was happening. Another time that people use theory building from cases is when it's just cool. And this is way back in the day, and probably a lot of you weren't even born, but when I did my fastest decisions making paper, thinking about fast was just cool. Like nobody'd been thinking about it. And it was like the easiest front end ever to write, because all I had to do was say, hey, nobody's writing about fast. Let's look at fast. It's important. Let's look at fast. So it's just something novel. It might also be something that's really important to managers. And again, to go back to Jeff Martin's work, the cross-business synergies is extremely important in the corporate world. And many managers both use the fact they can get synergies to justify things like diversification or M&A, but in fact, they don't know how to get those synergies. And so this was actually a really significant managerial problem that both the literature didn't really tell you the answer for, and managers didn't really know. So that was, I think, kind of interesting. And then finally, another one is, this is one that actually I'm now pulling from Nikolai Sigelkow, but you might do it just because it's a unique exemplar. And this is actually fairly common when, at least in my reviewing, a lot of people are doing this. They just get something that's just unusual. So for example, Charlie Galanik's dissertation was on a company we called Omni. Omni was the leading global tech firm for about 3 decades. It's as if Google continued to dominate for another 10 years. So it was an amazing company. Omni is no longer dominant, but was for many years. And they had a particular process that we felt was very unusual, and we studied that process. The Tripsis and Gavetti classic on Polaroid is another example. And there are a number of other examples of just taking a particular organizational situation that is just unusual. And you're not trying to be representative, but you're trying to rather explore something that's extreme that potentially has something interesting to say to a more normal setting. So in general, the idea around theory building from cases is you're usually asking research questions that are about process, so how things happen. And you're usually asking a question where you truly don't know the answer, and you're typically asking a bigger question than one would ask in a deductive study. So you're usually asking big questions, questions, some of which you could sort of drive a truck through the gap, it's so big. For example, Melissa's study on acquisition from the point of view of the seller. You're talking about a literature where 95% of the studies are from the buyer point of view, and you're turning it around, and there's this massive research gap. So that's often, it's not always that you get a massive research gap, but you certainly often have a bigger gap on average than a deductive researcher would have. And you're also typically, although not always, asking about how something happens. Okay, so far so good. Okay, when you not theory building from cases, when you want to know effect size. So let's suppose you're studying turnover and you have predictors of turnover like age of the employee and something about the company and something about the economic situation. Theory building from cases can't tell you which of those drivers of performance is more impactful. So you can't take 3 or 4 or 5 drivers of some dependent variable and say which is more important. Typically, in theory building from cases, you can't do that. It's hard to do interactions. So what's the interaction between the age of an employee and the environment and whether or not they turn over? It's hard to really deal with that very well. It's hard to deal with an incremental variable. So we know all these other variables. What's the added value of adding this incremental variable? So those questions are all ones that theory building from cases doesn't answer very well. So in general, the what questions, the how much questions are much more the province of traditional econometric deductive research. Okay, everybody good? See how our time's going? All right. All right, let's now get into what to do, which is probably what people are mostly interested in. So what do you do when you start with theory building from cases? And actually, the first point is for really starting any research project is the importance of really knowing the literature. I absolutely, with my students and with myself, insist on a really great literature review of whatever it is you're studying, whether it's alliances, whether it's turnover, whether it's organizational culture, whatever it is. You want to really know the literature that's already been done. You want to do that for a couple of reasons. One is, as the point on the slide says, you want to avoid just rediscovering what people already know. Often in your research, what will happen is you'll come across a finding, and it will be true and it's in your data, but it's what everybody already knows. And so you typically would say something like, well, of course we found X, and then go on to what you think is more interesting. Knowing the literature is also really important for identifying the research gap. If you don't know the research gap, it's very hard. If you don't know the research really well, it's hard to find a good gap. And then conversely, it's also hard to figure out your contributions. So if you don't know the literature well, you run the risk of just rediscovering what everybody already knows, picking a poor research gap, and not knowing what your contributions are. So absolutely knowing the literature is critical. I think some people would say, oh, but doesn't that like predispose you to some answer? Not really, because you don't want to find the answer that's already known. You're not actually looking for that answer. You prefer not to find that answer. So I think that never struck me as a particularly, it's certainly something you might think about, but it's much worse to not know the literature and walk into something blind. So again, I think really, whether you're doing inductive or deductive research, you certainly want to know the research literature. And I think deductive people are usually pretty good at that. I think more qualitative inductive people sometimes get sloppy about that. The second thing I think I also want to say about knowing the literature is really knowing it precisely. Like really, usually in any study, there may be many studies that are related to your topic, but there's usually only maybe 4 or 5 or 6 that are truly about your topic, and read those super carefully. To give you an example, Jason Davis did some work on how do major firms create R&D collaborations. So it was a study of innovation looking at companies like SAP and Cisco and how they might work together, for example, or how Alibaba might work with Intel. So it was how do major firms create collaborative R&D innovations? And what Jason did was read the prior literature very carefully. And there's a literature on what are the drivers of effective collaborations. And the prior work is largely about structural antecedents. So the prior work is largely econometric studies of structural antecedents. And those structural antecedents were things like, it's more effective if the partners are from the same country. It's more effective if both partners have an alliance group. It's most effective if partners have worked together before. So the number of antecedents that predict the outcome. So what Jason did was recognize those structural antecedents and then choose partnerships where those structural antecedents that predicted high performance were there. So rather than trying to rather than sort of forgetting these structural antecedents, he actually chose his cases based on those. So he looked at alliances where these were partners who had similar national cultural backgrounds. These were partners that had worked together before. These were partners that were sophisticated firms and done lots of alliances. So he picked firms, he picked collaborations that were likely to be successful, and then unpacked it. In fact, some of them were and some of them weren't. So you've controlled out antecedents, and you're focusing on, okay, we're now setting up the structural antecedents for success, but it's still the case that some work and some don't. And so this really, I think, showed how to do the study and why it was going to be useful. Again, to go back to Ben Hallen and his study of entrepreneurs forming ties, he carefully read the prior work in organization theory about ties formed when there's resource interdependence, and you form ties with people whom you already know or who your social network already knows. But what that literature doesn't look at, for example, it looks at who forms ties, but what it doesn't look at is whether or not it was an efficient tie formation process. So was the tie formation process fast? Did you form a tie with the partner you wanted? So it's as if the prior work would talk about, somebody formed a tie, just like you maybe formed a dating tie and you got to go to the prom, but and maybe that's a too US characteristic of the sort. When you get to go to the big dance and you're in high school and you ask your date and you get to go, it just looks at whether that tie happened. But what it doesn't look is whether or not you got your first choice date and how many dates you had to ask before somebody said yes, and so on. So it was really a deeper, more precise reading of the literature reveals the unexpected opportunities. So there's 2 points really on this slide. One is really know the literature, and the other is on that small number of studies that's very close to what you're looking at, really read that literature carefully. Okay, now what to do next in the first bucket is develop a research question that fits theory building from cases. And this somewhat repeats what I said earlier, but I'll just give you a comparison to show you what I mean. Badam Tabrizi, who was a student of mine, did a study of single product innovation, and it was in the computer industry, and it was looking at how innovation would work, but it was about a single product. And at the time that he wrote this, there were a lot of studies of single product innovation, lots of econometric studies, lots of qualitative studies, great studies. In contrast, Shona Brown wanted to do innovation, but she wanted to do a theory building from cases. And so what she realized is that literature, while it was great about single products, had really nothing to say about how do you do a portfolio of products, so product after product. And so while Benham's study made sense as a deductive econometric study because it was within a well-known literature and a set of ideas that were pretty well known, and he added to those, Shona really wanted to break out and go somewhere else. And so she was looking for that opportunity that was where you could drive the truck through the hole. The research questions are, as I said before, they're often bigger than deductive studies, but they're also on a continuum. Sometimes they're really quite theory building. You're really looking at a blank slate, and you really don't know what you're going to find. In contrast, sometimes it's more theory elaboration. For example, Felipe Santos did work on boundaries, and we knew a lot about how firms shape boundaries. And what his, I think, nuance was taking what we already knew about boundaries and seeing how companies combine different ways of thinking about a boundary. Is it a boundary of control? Is it about identity? Is it about M&A? What is it? So he took existing theories and really then put those together. So there is a continuum of really blank slate to theory elaboration, or which I think is what Amy Edmondson's term, or abduction is another term for it. Okay. By the way, am I talking too fast, Ebrat? Am I good? Is it okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes,
okay.
Perfect.
Good. Okay. And if I do get fast, do signal somehow. Okay, so that's what to do first. What to do second? This is, I think, if I had to think about my own work, this is probably where I think I've contributed the most to theory building from cases. And it's also an area that I think many researchers fail to think about. In fact, I was talking to Mike Pratt a little while ago. You know, Mike Pratt is an editor at ASQ and a pretty well known published author. And he was saying that he'd read some of my work. So wait a minute, it's this research design and the way that I'm thinking about theoretical sampling is actually really something that he had missed. And then he started realizing in his own work he was intuitively doing it, but he hadn't actually thought consciously about what he was doing. But the idea is that it's very important when you're choosing cases to think about where's the locus of the variation, and you do that through theoretical sampling. So, and maybe just to step back, one of the really major differences between theory building from cases and deductive research is deductive research is about random sampling, and theory building from cases is about theoretical sampling. You're choosing samples. You're choosing your sample not because you think it's representative and not as you would in deductive research, but rather because it's going to tell you something theoretically relevant. There are a couple of different designs that I think people are articulating at this. One of my favorites, which works particularly in studies, but works in a lot of situations, is what's known as a racing design, where you have a set of firms or a set of people or a set of somethings starting whatever it is they're doing at the same time, and that they're relatively matched in terms of various kinds of demographic characteristics. And then you watch the race and see who finishes the race first. And the race could be about getting to an IPO, surviving. It could be some sort of measure of success, but something sort of a milestone that you're racing to. So for example, Pinar had them racing to who built the best alliance portfolio. Rory McDonald, they were racing for a business model. Doug Hanna was looking at, they were racing for an ecosystem. And what each of these studies has the companies starting at the same time. These are all entrepreneurial companies in this case. For example, Doug has, I believe it's 5 companies in the residential solar industry. They all started at about the same year, and they all start with management teams that look as if they should be successful. So they're basically starting at the starting line, and you can't tell who's going to win at the start because they all starting at the same time, they're doing the same thing, and they look roughly similar, and they have similar funding or something, things like that. And then you see what happens. So that's a really nice way where you're actually controlling a lot of variation you don't care about. For example, we all know that better teams are more likely to do well. You don't want to, you find that, but you don't really want to focus on that. So you want to control out the things you don't care about and focus on the things that you do care about. Another strategy is to use what's known as common antecedents. I told you about Jason Davis's study of the 8 R&D collaborations, and he basically choosing collaborations where you think that where a priori you think they're going to be successful. Experienced firms, successful firms, great resources. So you've eliminated the possibility of acquisition, you're controlling for antecedents. And then what he did was looked at variation, because he had common antecedents, but then there was some variation across industries, which then gave him some generalizability. Sam Garg is another example. He was interested in looking at how CEOs manage their boards. So he's turning around the classic agency problem and making the CEO the principal and the board members the agent. What he did was look at first-time CEOs, because he wanted to see what they were learning and what the variation would be. If you looked at experienced CEOs, you probably would have just seen a set of CEOs that already knew how to manage their boards. But if you looked at first-time CEOs, you were actually probably going to create variance because some of them were going to be more effective at doing this than others. He also looked at Series B ventures, which means if you looked at Series A or C, the board doesn't really do anything. It's the firm is too new. So you want to look at firms where there's a product and there's revenue and there's actually something for the board to do. So each of these cases you're looking at, each of these studies, you're trying to think about what are the antecedents that would predict what I'm trying to look at. In the case of Jason, he was trying to pull out the predictors of success. In the case of Sam, he was trying to pick CEOs where there was likely to be variation. But you're sort of thoughtfully thinking about that rather than just taking whatever you can get. Another example is polar types, which is looking for high and low performers. It's often high and low performers, but it can mean high and low innovators, companies with high turnover, low turnover, groups with more effective and less effective dynamics. It can be whatever you want, but if you take extremes of very good and very bad, or very high and very low, of whatever it is, it tends to sharpen the contrast. It tends to let you see more clearly the differences than you might otherwise. So, for example, Tim Ott and I, in a recent paper, we're looking at how do firms form strategy in a complex novel setting, and we use marketplaces. Marketplaces being companies like Airbnb or Uber or so on, that have buyers and sellers in the marketplace, and they have to fit together. And what we did was we looked at a marketplace, 3 pairs of marketplaces. One was about in-home services, one was about entertaining, and the third one was around parking. So there were 3 pairs, and in the pairs, one formed a strategy and one ended up failing. And so it was they really maybe I'll just point out there's 2 aspects to this design. One is it's a polar type, so it's a high and low pair. The other aspect of this design is it's also creating variation because it's across different marketplaces, and that variation is giving you generalizability. So you're always thinking about what am I controlling for, and how am I creating generalizability? The Jeff Martin study on cross-business synergy was also, I think, one of a really clever study. What he did was he was interested in synergies, looked for an industry where there were likely to be a lot of synergies, software, multi-business software. So firms like SAP, Adobe, Microsoft, Symantec are likely, some of the Japanese firms are likely to be multi-business software firms, and there are lots of opportunities in software for cross-business synergies and collaboration. So what he did was look at multi-business software companies, 6 of them, and then looked at what that particular company, each of the particular companies, said was both a high and a low performing collaboration. So you're controlling for the software firm, it's the same firm, for example, it's Microsoft, and for a situation in when just the Microsoft businesses collaborated really well, and you're looking for a situation in which the Microsoft businesses collaborated really poorly. So what you've done is you've looked in a setting, you're likely to find the phenomenon, and you've controlled out a lot of the variation around the people, because it's the same people, sometimes collaborating well and sometimes not. And then you're trying to understand why that turns out. Another design that you may also use is, you may find equifinal paths. So to go back to Ben on the funding ties and entrepreneurs, his sample is well connected. He looks at as I recall, about 12 companies, and he looks at well connected high status funders and what they do, looks at what happens, and then he also looks at nobody funders and what they do. So Elon Musk versus, I don't know, Ebrat, and Ebrat would actually have a much different strategy for getting money than Elon would. And then he also looked in Silicon Valley and not, because in case there was some sort of Silicon Valley effect. So he's thinking about equifinal paths. Both Ebrat and Elon get money, but they use different strategies. And also taking a look at and trying to understand, are there some sort of contingencies, like there's something about a location like Silicon Valley that might be relevant. So this adds some nuance and some interest. At the same time, Ben was also controlling things. For example, he was looking at a particular industry, internet security, at a particular time. So he wasn't having everything varying, but he was consciously varying things that he thought were going to be important for how one would form a tie, whether you're high status or whether you're not, whether you're in Silicon Valley and whether you're not. So he's looking at firms in all those buckets, essentially stratified sampling, if you want to take a deductive point of view. Sometimes I've talked a lot about, so far, papers or studies that are about high and low of something, or more or less of something. But sometimes you also do studies where you're looking for similarity. So Chris Bingham's study of simple rules was around, the focus was around learning from process experience, and he wasn't looking for variation. He was looking for how do executives learn from their process experience? In his case, he was looking at how do executives learn from their international experience. So what do they learn when they go from France to Germany to Singapore to Malaysia? What do they learn from those successive experiences? And so he was looking for similarity. At the same time, he also wanted generalizability. So he looked at companies from 3 fairly culturally distant countries, Singapore, the US, and Finland. So he's looking for the similarity of firms from 3 different countries. So he's looking for similarity. And then by adding in different countries, he was also able to increase his generalizability. Because if all he'd done was study US firms, or if all he'd done was study Finnish firms, then people would say, well, that's a study of US, or that fit for Finland, but does it generalize? And so this was a way to both look for similarities and see the similarities in which people learn, but also to deal with what might be cross-cultural differences. He could have found that it was different. He could have found that people learn differently in Singapore than in the US. It turned out that people are people, and people learn in very similar ways. Melissa Grebner did the same thing in her study of acquisition from the seller point of view. She looked at firms, first of all, where the firm actually did sell, but she also looked at a firm that didn't sell despite opportunities to sell. And then she looked, but she was looking for similarities in terms of how and why people sold and why they might not sell. But then she looked across several different industries to give herself generalizability. So often when you're if you're looking for similarity across your cases, then you're also looking for something that's also creating generalizability for you. So this is probably, all of this discussion is probably fairly complex, but I think it's a really misunderstood, neglected part of what makes for a successful study, is seriously thinking about where's the variation, where's the control. And if you have access to, I think I asked actually Ebrat to potentially put it in the chat, but a link to the article I did about a year ago on what is the Eisenhardt method. There's a pretty big discussion of different kinds of research designs that might give you the space to actually sit and think, whereas in a talk like this, you don't have time to really stop and think. Finally, to the question of single versus multiple case, I think, let me catch myself up on my own slides. I think, first of all, some studies that look like they're single case are really actually multi-case because they're using embedded design. So, for example, Ben Hallen in his study of ventures and funding, he was looking at the venture, but he was also looking at the funding rounds. So we had funding rounds within ventures. Charlie Gallenick's study of Omni looked like it was a study of one company, but then it was looking at charter changes within that company. I just did a recent study with Rob Bremner on the drone industry, and we looked at 2 firms, but within those firms, we looked at 3 innovations. So one of the nuances that you might think about is an embedded design, which takes what ostensibly is maybe a single case or maybe a paired case, is actually really much more multi-case, because you're looking at a high level, it's one case, but you're actually then unpacking separate cases. And I mentioned to you before my conversation with Mike Pratt, and that's something that Mike has done. He looks like a single case, like a study of a hospital, but in fact, he's unpacking. This is what happened for, I'm making this up now, anesthesiologists versus surgeons versus some other kind of doctor. So some things that look to be single case are actually analyzed as multi-case, either because the design is embedded from a structural point of view, or because the design is embedded over time. So in the drone case, we looked at DJI, the Chinese drone maker, and we looked at 3 successive innovations. So they had so it's embedded in the sense that there was innovation 1, innovation 2, innovation 3 unfolding over time. So my first point is that single cases are often actually being analyzed as multi-case. So you think they're single case, but in fact, many of the more effective studies that are apparently single case are actually embedded designs that are multi-case. And the straight up comparison between single versus multi-case, if you just really are doing a single case, the problem with a single case is that you have an overdetermined answer. And so it's very hard to tell in a single case what's the right level of construct abstraction. And it's very hard to tell what's important and what isn't, because you don't have enough examples. Rather, what you have is let's say it's a study of, what would be a study? A study of the effectiveness of an organizational field in dealing with climate change. And you've got a giant study of how an organizational field is effective in climate change. But if you only have one example of that, you have too many variables going on. And so you can't really unpack it. It's like mathematically, when you have too many equations for something, you're overdetermined. And so single cases tend to overdetermine. And so it's hard to figure out what's really happening because you have no comparison. And it's hard to figure out what's the right level of the constructs, the abstraction level of the constructs, because again, you don't have anything to compare it to. So that's why you see in single case studies often, not always, but often, you see diagrams at the end that are more complicated than multi-case and at a lower level of abstraction. So you tend to see more spaghetti diagrams that don't generalize as well, because the single case doesn't give you enough comparison. You've got too many variables going on and you can't really tell. It's harder to unpack what's actually happening in the situation because there are too many potential explanatory variables. And you also then secondarily, you can't figure out what's the right level of abstraction. So single case is okay, but it's harder. I think it's harder to really find an insight. And I think many of the cases that you see that are ostensibly single case, in fact, I think what the analysis is, it's an embedded design and they've created multi-case precisely so they can have that kind of a comparison. So is that, I'm not sure, everybody good with that? I see Ebrat thinking about it. Yeah, that might take some thought, but if you think about the fact that you can't, whereas if you have, let's say, if you have multi-case, let's say you have 6 cases, 6 times the data, then you had 1 have more data. But you also have to look for similarities across all the cases. And as you do that, you start to eliminate variables. So let's say in your first case, we had our organizational field meeting and it was in the winter and we did it in Europe and there was a really big resource provider there, but you wouldn't know which of all those things actually mattered. But if you had 6 cases of a similar phenomenon, you say, oh, well, time of the year didn't matter at all because look, it was great in the summer over here. And oh, this other thing didn't. So you start to be able to eliminate things that are harder to eliminate, for example. Okay, so hopefully that's sort of clear to people anyway. But the idea is you get simpler, better, you get simpler models that are more, because what you want in theory is you want parsimony. You want the simplest theory you can have that still predicts whatever it is you want. And then you want a more accurate abstraction, and you want a theory that is more robust across different settings. So to go back to the beginning when I started talking, theory building from cases is about theory building. And so what are the conditions under which you get better theories? And you typically get better theories with more cases. Not so many cases you can't analyze it, but with some number of cases that you can analyze. And just parenthetically, and I probably won't talk about it too much today, but one of the reasons why theory building from cases and machine learning go together so well is because they're both pattern recognition techniques. And theory building from cases gives you the simple theory, and then machine learning gives you the scale to replicate. So they're actually they're both similar techniques, but they're also super complementary. Anyway, that's a segue that maybe is an added complexity you don't want. But the point, maybe to go back to what's the point here, the point here is that a lot of people are sloppy in thinking about how they're doing their theoretical sampling. And I think it's hugely important because it just really sharpens what your results are at the end. Okay, data collection. Data collection is pretty straightforward. I think everybody kind of gets data collection. It has to fit with the question, it has to fit with the research setting, and it has to fit with the practicalities of how much time you have and how much time organizations will give you. Sometimes theory building from cases uses observation. So for example, the ethnographers, people like Kate Kellogg, Beth Betschke, social psych researchers, Amy Edmondson, Kim Ellsbach, are often studying work, and observation is the way you do that. Sam Garg, who was studying CEOs and boards, it made sense to go, for example, to observe board meetings. One of the go-to data collection techniques is interviews. Typically, you want and here a lot of when you think about data collection, the way you think about it is very similar to the way you think about it in deductive research. So sampling is very different from deductive research, but data collection is sort of similar. You try to collect data in the ways that make the most sense in the setting you are. More data for more variant, more information is better than less. Typically, you're looking at a process question, so you may want to get ways over time. Typically, you're also looking inside organizations, so you want variation on informants. Maybe you want senior people or lower level people. You may want accounting people or marketing people. You may want to do some closed end. You want to maybe do some open-ended questions. And it depends on what you're looking at. So for example, Melissa's study of acquisition from the seller point of view, there were actually relatively few informants who knew about the acquisition, because acquisition is typically very confidential. By contrast, Jason's study of R&D collaborations across big companies like SAP and Intel, there were a lot of informants because you have multi-levels of the hierarchy across several firms. Archival is becoming really, I think, important. Because of the explosion of resources, blogs, YouTube, whatever. Survey can be useful. I think people neglect surveys, but surveys can be useful if they're constructs that you think are going to be relevant. For example, if you think that conflict is going to be relevant, you might actually want to gather quantitative data on conflict or whatever other variable think might be relevant. So you're both have open-ended data from interviews about what people did or were doing, but you also may have some closed-end data that are surveys about constructs you think are going to be important. You may be using archival sources are great because there's so many of them, and because you can actually go back in time. So you could actually see what people were saying, for example, on their blog 10 years ago. Whereas if you ask them today, their memory's pretty fuzzy. So data collection is pretty obvious, I think. I think what's more interesting is analyzing. And this is, I think, where a lot of the sort of the heat on the debate in the theory building from cases world is around how do you analyze. I personally think it's not that big a deal. I think there's a way you think about analyzing, and it's the same whether you're me or you're Denny Joya or you're Kate Kellogg or whoever you are. There's the same basic idea. Whereas I think the one that's really neglected is the research. I think research design is super neglected. I think there's a lot of talk about analysis. The way that you do analysis is I'll tell you the way I do it, but I think it's similar to the way other people do it. You typically have a case. Let's say in my situation, it's often a firm, but it's not always a firm. Sometimes it's an R&D project or it's an acquisition, but it's whatever the case is. And you write that story, and you write typically a chronological case. Maybe the first researcher writes the case, the second researcher corroborates it. Maybe you go back to your setting and ask your informants to corroborate it, and you focus the case on answering the research question in some sort of broad themes. I find it's useful if researchers operate a little bit independently, so you have different perspectives on the case. But you typically write some sort of a case study of whatever the focal unit of analysis is. Then you start getting into cross-case comparisons, and people do that. I think people have their own style for that. Some people get into a lot of like software and using software and that sort of stuff to pull out themes and all that. I tend to not do that because I think when you distance yourself too far from the data, you lose track of the big picture. So you can get into kind of granular measures of things and granular use of software and how often something is said. And that may be interesting if you're studying identity or some sort of linguistic set of constructs. For somebody like me who's studying strategy, it's not that interesting. So I tend to do more looking at my cases and comparing and contrasting them in all the different ways I can think of. So if it's, let's say, a study with 6 cases, I'll compare case A and B and C and C and D and D and A and look at them all different ways. Maybe say, pick a construct and say, well, how do they differ on this? And just sort of what you try to do is you try to look at the data in all the different ways you can, and then come up with associations and then measures and constructs. And other people call it first and second order themes. I mean, that's a way to, but essentially what everyone is doing, whether it's Denny or Kate or it's me or it's, some other, Shazan Sari, or I don't know, Anne Langley, whoever it is. What we're all doing is we're going from data and we're trying to see a pattern in that data and develop constructs and relationships. So everybody's doing that. How exactly we're doing it is different. I don't know that there's a better and a worse way. I think it somewhat depends on the data that you have, so it depends practically on your personal style. But it's always about, that's the heart of grounded theory building, right? It's about looking at data and trying to find the patterns in those data and elevate them to a more abstract level of constructs. So it's all, and it's very similar to what you do deductively. Deductively, you have a construct, like you're measuring size of the firm, and you have measures of that, number of employees or whatever. So in the deductive world, you're doing the same thing. You've got constructs and you have measures. It's just the measures are simpler in the deductive world. Whereas in the inductive qualitative case world, you're often pulling together measures that are fundamentally from qualitative data. You're not always using qualitative data, but you're trying to pull together themes and constructs where a large part of the measurement is trying to measure qualitative data. So there's a lot of journal space, both in debate as well as just in a paper, giving you the blow by blow account of how people did this process. And I always find that I don't believe that's really what they did, because I don't think people are, I think it's too creative a process to actually write in a paper. So I think it's kind of fake, and I think it's not that useful to see it. But it takes up a lot of space, and there's a lot of debate. It's personally, I would rather judge other things than that. But anyway, so what you do is you understand the first case, then you do cross case, and that's when and this is where replication logic, by the way, comes in. Is, let's say you see an association, you see it in case A and you see it in case D, but do you also see it in C and B? And that's what replication logic is about. Can you test your emerging theory in every case, and what do you see? And when you start to be able to replicate the associations of the patterns that you're seeing across the cases, then you're starting to have something. And one of the tricks or skills, or whatever you want to call it, of theory building from cases is to be able to understand the construct at a sufficiently abstract level that it makes sense across the cases. So to give you an example, what might be let's see, I don't know, let's say that one of in forming a tie, it's important to do some sort of informal networking. And so the construct is informal networking. But what you're really seeing in the case is, for example, person A is doing informal networking by inviting people to lunch, and person B is doing informal networking by walking around the office and talking to people, and person C is doing informal networking by going to good friends and asking them to meet other people. So at a very low level, they're all doing different things. But if you have a more abstract understanding of what they're doing, they're all doing the same thing. And so the art of theory building from cases is to be able to take the very particular instances of behavior or whatever it is at the case level and see it at a more abstract level, so that at the low level it looks like everybody's different, but at the high level it's really all the same. And so that's really what part of the art is. And I don't know how you teach somebody that, and I don't know exactly how you write that up in a journal article, but I can tell you that's what you do, is that you try to understand the patterns that you're seeing at a logic level that's fitting across the cases. And so people sometimes say to me, well, how come your studies always fit together so well? You must be dropping cases. I never drop a case, unless, we just couldn't get the data or something, but I never drop a case. Rather, what I do is, first of all, I'm looking for the similarity. That's the point. Number two, there's usually some variation, but I don't make a big deal of it in a paper because you don't want to emphasize that for your reviewers. But the third thing is because I understand categories, I can do categorization and abstraction. So it's about both categorization, which I think Stina Grodahl has been writing about lately. It's getting the categories right. So in the example of informal networking, it's seeing the informal networking as the category and seeing that that's the right abstraction level in which you then can start theorizing. So that's really the art. And I don't think you can, I haven't seen this is like the eureka moment. This is the pattern, this is the creativity that you really can't write about very easily. At least I don't see how you can write about it in a paper, but it is in fact what you're doing. And what you see at the end is when someone has been able to do it and it's worked for them, what you see is either a data structure like Denny Joya would have, second order themes, first order themes, or you have what I would use, which is data tables, but you would see the constructs and you would see how they're grounded in the data. But you wouldn't know very easily how we got there because it's too creative, I think, to write about. But you would know at the end whether you'd found it. Then finally, what you also do at a certain point is you start iterating with the literature. What literature relates to the pattern that I'm seeing? And that's starting to give you the theoretical logic, because you can see an association, like in informal networking gives you promotions. Let's say informal networking is tied to being promoted. But if you don't have a theoretical story for why informal networking leads to promotion, you don't have a theory. And so you've really got to think about, well, why is the association I'm seeing true? And you can do that. That's essentially the internal validity of the theory. But you can do that through logic. You can do that because your cases may tell you. So somebody may say, I really did this informal networking and, I got a promotion because this and this and this happened. Or you see it, or you see it in other literature. So for example, I did a recent paper on marketplaces with Tim Ott, where we were looking at a strategy form and in complex novel problems. So the theoretical problem was, how do you form a strategy in a complex novel problem? Because you have to both deal with the uncertainty of being novel, but you also have to deal with the complexity of interconnectedness. And so a strategy like modular problem solving doesn't work. And so what do you do? And what we did was we had some insights from our data, and then we went to cognitive science. And the cognitive science literature was extraordinarily important for us to understand why we were seeing what we were seeing. But to simply state an association, blue-eyed people get promotions, and you have no theory as to why blue-eyed people get promotions. You're just seeing an association, and it's not hard to see an association in a small number of cases. So what's the point here? So just to go back, when you're analyzing, you first analyze the individual case, then you start analyzing cross-case, looking for associations and measures and abstraction levels, and then you often bring in the literature at the end to try and really sharpen up the theoretical argument that underlies what you're finding. Okay, is that working for everybody? Or are we on time? Okay. Yeah, maybe there's just a little reminder here. Remember if it's theory building from cases, the point is theory building, right? And so you're looking for a good theory. Are the constructs well defined? Are the measures? And I use the term measures because I like to tie to deductive research whenever I can, because I think my work reaches a broader audience. Because we all know 80% of the researchers in our field are deductive researchers. But you could be measures, you could be calling this themes, you could call it second order constructs, whatever. And then, but you're looking for measures or something, you're essentially grounding. And then you're also looking for the theoretical logic. So that's what a theory is. It's constructs, It's underlying grounding in empirics, and there's an underlying theoretical logic. Finally, writing, I'll just say a little bit about writing. Writing is always a matter of you need to be logical and tied to the literature, but you also have to think about the aesthetics of the writing. So what makes it fun and interesting to read. And you're always balancing how much data do I present versus how much theory. I know sometimes I've been criticized in my work that I have, that my stories aren't rich enough. And my response to that is always, first of all, I usually have more cases than single case people. So I've got more stuff I have to cover. And secondly, you know, in a 40-page paper, there's just not that much room. And so you have to be careful about balancing data and theory. With that as kind of an overarching point, let me just say that you typically want to make clear what your emergent theory is and the core insights. And you usually can do that with some sort of a summary table or a figure or a diagram, but you usually want something like that. And as I said before, one of the hallmarks of multiple cases is the diagrams are simpler. They're simpler, they're more, I think, they're better theoretically because they're simpler. They're simpler and they're really targeting what's important as opposed to a bunch of spaghetti. Secondly, as you're writing the heart of the paper, you're writing about each proposition, finding, theme, whatever you want to call it. You're saying, okay, I found this finding or this theme or this proposition. And then you're illustrating that with examples from your cases, with quotes in the text, the story and the quotes in the text. But then you also have backup, either figures or evidence that's showing the reader more of your data. So in the actual text, you can, let's say, I'm illustrating that these informal networking processes, and I'm describing, let's say, oh, Ebrat, you know, always is asking his friends out to lunch and does this, and then I have quotes from him saying he's doing that. But then I'll have a table that says, and here's, I'm looking at Gabby and Elizabeth and somebody else are, you know, this is the table that also is what they're doing. So I'm writing about a particular person, but I'm showing a particular case, but I'm showing the data some way in tables or figures. I'm also, from a rhetorical point of view, often prefacing with some sort of naive prior view. So I'll start with, you know, prior literature says X, or you would think X, but it's really Y. So I'll usually try to write rhetorically, but that's rhetorical. That's not really part of the method. I think this is another point. This is like, if I can star this point, in papers that I review, one of the biggest weakness is there's no underlying theoretical argument. I'll read a paper and they'll tell me, you know, doing these behaviors leads to a promotion, or doing these behaviors leads to an IPO or whatever, but it never tells, there's no logic of why that's true. And so people tend to, even though they're theory building from cases, they don't put the theoretical logic in, they just put the associations in. And I think that's related to the sort of anal emphasis on how people went from data to theory. Because that's just about the association of the data with the constructs, but it's not about the underlying theoretical argument. You don't get the theoretical argument from the data necessarily. You get it from logic, you get it from literature, and you may get it from the data, but you don't always get it from the data. So what I think is missing in most papers when I read them the first time through in the review process is there's no theoretical argument for why whatever it is they said was true is true. And then finally, what you typically try to do is you try to bookend a paper discussion with the introduction in the background. And I often write the deduction. I write the introduction first, but I refine the discussion more. So I spend more time, I do the discussion, and then I go back to the introduction. Because it's easier to write the introduction if you already know what you found, because then you can set your gap better. And the introduction is probably the last part of the paper I actually finish. And it's also the part, as I'm sure all of you who you know, who've been submitting papers know, you know, you're always getting complaints about framing. You know, and they just get those all the time. You get less of those if you start with your discussion, know what your contributions are, know what you did, and then go back and bookend it at the front end. Okay, we've been talking for a while here. I'll just say a couple more things and then I, really open it up. A couple of myths about theory building from cases. It's not about a particular kind of data. You can use quantitative data. You can kind of use any sort of data. It's not about a number of cases. I think 4 to 10 cases work well, but you can have more cases, like the classic bricolage study that Nelson and Baker's got 29. There are people who do single cases that work fine. I've been using pairs more recently. So 4 to 10s kind of works, but not always. But you can do whatever you want. It's not about performance. I think sometimes people think theory building from cases, particularly my work, is about performance. I write about performance because I'm a strategy person, and strategy people write about performance, but it's not about the method's not about performance. Probably the worst myth is the myth about variance in process. How can you have a theory about differences in processes, which is variance, but it's also a process? And there's this old, like 1982 paper that somehow got reified as some like amazing piece of work, and it's kind of not. But there's this process variance difference, and I think it's just sort of gotten in the way, because you can have a study of processes, which is sort of events over time, and there's difference. And you have, say, you have a couple of cases. You can have a process A in the one, and process B in the two, and so process C, and one might be better or worse. So you can see variance across processes. You can see similarity across processes. You can see, so it's just kind of like not a very meaningful dichotomy. I think it's just sort of pointless. Yes, any particular study can be variance in process, or it can be process and similarity, or it can be, so I just don't think, anyway, that to me has been a red herring that just sort of gets in the way and is kind of a pointless comment. Okay, maybe, yeah. So now we're starting to get some participants. How about it? Seham, am I saying that correctly? Seham, you're wearing your
yes. I thank you so much for this. I have a question related to using a single case for building a new theory and inducing concepts from the empirical data. I know it's very challenging, but would having a very ununique company or case study help to build a theory based on single case study?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the so-called talking pig. So you have a very unusual case, like the case that Charlie had of Omni, very unusual company. You could do that. What you would typically, I think, find would be more effective for you is you might have that single case about that unique company or that unique situation. But if you were able to analyze that with an embedded design, I think it would be easier for you to analyze. So if you could break it up into, let me go back to the DJI example. That study is a study of DJI and a company called 3DR. And DJI is a very unique company. It is probably the first Chinese company to become a global leader in a tech industry where it is their technology leading the way. So it's a very unique company. And what we were able to do is to really understand that company better, because yes, it was it was actually a paired case, but I'll focus on it as being a single case. But we could see in successive innovations the implications of how that company was run. So it was a single case firm, but we were actually analyzing it, innovation. So the degree to which you single case and break it up into embedded cases. Back to
yes.
Yeah. So you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So basically using embedded units of analysis, right?
Right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, Ravi?
Yeah, hi. I was a little bit curious about, you're somebody who's done work in simulations and qualitative work, which is kind of very polar opposites maybe. And I know when you talk about how you do your qualitative work, you say, all right, I want to set it up so that future subsequent quantitative scholars can work on it. And yeah, so if we're doing regression-based research, right? I mean, you can only pick a few variables. And so maybe the parsimony that you're talking about makes a lot of sense. But if you look at a lot of simulation stuff, I mean, you might look at like system dynamics models, and they take these really rich single qualitative case studies and it's all spaghetti, right? It's all that sort of complexity. So like, might it be the case that as we get better and more sophisticated quantitatively and can use more complex simulation models, that there'll be more room for complex qualitative single case studies, and that might be useful? And so like we should be more descriptive and stay closer to the ground? Is that like a possibility, you think?
I think a spaghetti model is a spaghetti model, whether it's simulation or it's a case. And so people have different objectives. If your objective is to build a theory, maybe I'll go to this slide. If your objective is building theory, what you're looking for something is parsimonious, it's precise, it's logical. If you're looking to describe something, so for example, the objective of an ethnographer is often to describe something. The objective of system dynamics people is often to describe, for example, how climate change is happening. If what your objective is description, then a single case and a complex simulation makes sense. So if what I care about is understanding Earth and how climate change is happening, I probably have a spaghetti model. If I'm trying to have some sort of theory about something, then I'd probably have something simpler, more parsimonious than that. So I think it really depends on your objective. So does that make sense, Ravi?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Nasrin?
Thank you very much, Dr. Eisenhardt, for sharing your insight. And I really like your definition of theory in the 2021 paper. So I've been reading about that paper, and you've really emphasized the central role of time in cases and in the paper. But I find it challenging to address the generalizability in the paper. If we are focusing on the time, it might be difficult to find similar cases in different locations or in one location. For example, if we want to study the emergence of a phenomena in a particular location, then it could be quite challenging. So could you please elaborate on that point, how to deal with the case, choosing the case, theoretical case, and the generalizability issue?
Okay, I didn't quite catch what you were studying in the emergence of what? What was the example you were giving? I didn't quite understand it.
I'm trying to understand the emergence of our research in artificial intelligence or use of artificial intelligence in Montreal.
So emergence of artificial intelligence in what?
In the healthcare cluster in Montreal.
Okay, all right, so I'm trying to understand how artificial intelligence emerged in the healthcare industry in Montreal. Okay, what I would probably do is I might look at several different hospitals in Montreal and look at how artificial intelligence emerged in those. So very much like what a Kate Kellogg study would look like, where I would look at several hospitals that are each using artificial intelligence, and I would see what happened over time. You don't always have to do over time, although I think one of the real benefits of qualitative research is you can go over time. So I would look for something like that. Let's look at different health, or maybe you might, get on the train and go to Toronto. So you might, okay, I'll do a hospital in Toronto and a hospital in Montreal just for some generalizability. But I think the easy thing to do would be several settings within Montreal looking at the use of artificial intelligence.
So it would be more like an embedded design. Like, for example, if I focus on one specific use of AI in different settings, right?
You could do that. So for example, using AI, like you could use across settings, the use of AI in detection of breast cancer. Or you could look at a single setting and say, okay, let's look at the use of AI in detection of breast cancer and in this, skin cancer and some other pathology. So you could look at one hospital and look at several different applications of AI, or you could look across several hospitals on the same. I think the obvious is kind of the obvious way you do them. And there might be some advantages to having them all having started their AI journey at the same time, but that you may not be able to do that. And then you could just kind of forget about that because it may not be that important, whether they started in 2020 or 2021, or it may not matter.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to map the AI journey, and that's why my second question. When you were referring to informal networking, are you referring to any specific paper?
No, I just made that up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Sakvir?
So I just have a question, like, so you've given us examples of cases as organizations and of cases as pairs of organizations, like the buyer-seller example. But did you have any example of a case as a constellation of organizations?
Let's see. Well, the Jason Davis is two organizations. I don't really constellation. I don't have a good example because I don't work at that level of analysis. I'm sure there are some of like coalitions of standards companies. There are also studies of communities that you could think of as constellations. So I don't have a particular good example to give you because I don't follow that literature that well, but I certainly think there could be. There's no reason that you couldn't study at that level of analysis.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so Manoj?
Yeah, hi, thank you for the lecture. So I wanted to, I'm an entrepreneurship researcher, and in that sense, I am more interested towards individuals. So in the way you have talked about analyzing cases, analyzing firms with cases, can I use the similar process to analyze entrepreneurs? And I'm trying to understand the entrepreneurial ecosystem from the entrepreneur's perspective by keeping the entrepreneur as a central actor. So how do you view that?
Well, I think you think about what phenomena, what aspect of entrepreneurs are you trying to think about? And then you'd look at several different entrepreneurs and how they do whatever the focal phenomenon is and compare them. And you might want to, make these similar entrepreneurs, like these are all entrepreneurs in the same industry that are about the same age. You might want to do it that way. So you'd be controlling on the demographics of the entrepreneur and then seeing differences. Or you might alternatively want to do more of a similarities type study and look at different kinds of entrepreneurs and see how they're all alike. But you really want to think about where you're looking for, where you want the similarity to be and where you want the variation to be. And you can do it a couple different ways.
Okay. That means I can kind of use a similar process to understand a single entrepreneur by considering that entrepreneur's journey as a case study, right? Or the perspective of the entrepreneur as a case study.
Right. So that you could have a case study about an individual, and that individual could be, I don't know what that, forming a team, or that individual, you could be studying team formation. You could be studying money raising. You can be studying how that individual entrepreneur changes his or her identity. Yeah, but definitely you could have the unit of analysis be the entrepreneur. Okay?
Thank you.
You got it? Okay, thanks. Yeah, Edward?
Edward, we can't hear you.
Still muted.
So sorry, I'm so sorry. It was on mute. Yeah. So all right. So my question was on how do we choose cases, and based on the. Now I'm looking at relationship between constructs, and specifically I was looking at relationship between team resilience and constructs such as team psychological safety and empathy within teams. So should I be looking at variation? Should I be looking at replication? I was not so sure about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly driven by, how you choose the cases is partly driven on where you can get access. And then thinking about the design. So it's always a matter of the practical problem of who's going to let me in with the intellectual problem of how am I going to design the study. So you typically would want to be thinking about those at the same time. And so if you can get into a setting of a particular type, then you might want to, okay, well, now I've got this type, then I might want to, okay, can I find a setting that's a similar type? Or can I, in which case I would then look more than at variance across those sites. Or if I'm going to look at very different kinds of sites, I might try to look at the same process. So there's always an interplay between what am I going to study and where can I actually get in. So you're kind of always playing those together.
And a related question was, so for example, in my previous study, I've looked at organization from an organization resilience perspective, and I found a number of organizations that were resilient. So the question was, do I go in depth within one organization look for resilient teams within different divisions, and can I compare them, or should I still look for different organizations?
Yeah, I mean, you could do it. You could do a couple of ways. You could look at, we'll say, you have one organization, and you could look at teams that are, the resilience of teams in that. And so then you'd have multiple, at least from my perspective, you'd have multiple teams you'd be looking at within a single company, or you could look across several different resilient companies and study them. And maybe you could say then you'd have several different companies, and you then have several different teams within the companies you're also comparing. So there's several different ways you could organize it, but you just want to be aware of what you were doing.
Sure. Thank you.
So there's not like a right answer. There's multiple ways you could do it, and it partly depends on who's going to let you in. So if only on one organization lets you in, then that's what you study, and then you look for embedded opportunities within that single organization.
Thanks. And last quick one. In case of an academic study like a dissertation, where generally you are the individual researcher, how do you try and get in an independent perspectives of researchers?
Well, usually you'd have an advisor. You might have you and your advisor, maybe your advisor and another grad student or another professor is in on it as well. So so that's how you would do it.
Okay.
Who
Thank
happens
you.
to be in the scene that you're in. Yeah, Sebastian? Yeah, thanks for asking, Edward.
Thank you very much for a super interesting presentation. I have a question regarding how to best analyze archival data, because I'm looking at a firm which is older than 100 years old, and I'm looking at all the individual business models. They have 24, 25 different business models over the 100 years that they were using. And now my question is, it's really hard or not possible to go back all the 100 years with only interviews. And now I was looking into process tracing of George and Bennett and Collier 2011. I'm not sure if you know this. And my question is how to best analyze archival data, which is really going back far into the past.
Yeah, I haven't done too much really old archival data stuff, but it's the same idea as any other data, where you're looking for the more data you have, the better, right? So if you're looking at a company that was around, I don't know, in 1920, more data about 1920 is better. So more archival sources, more different people writing about that company, newspaper articles, firsthand accounts from executives at the time, historians' view retrospectively. So the more ways in which the more data sources you have, the better. So I think that's sort of the big picture insight. Exactly how you study it, I think I don't know enough about historical methods to know, but certainly the idea that more sources, from more perspectives gives you richer data. And what you may want to do in your study is not study every business model, but say study a business model that's well documented from every decade. So here's the 1920 business model. I'm looking at the 1931, the 1941. And so
thank you very much. That's really helpful. And also maybe an add-on question, what do you do with contradicting data? Because there is, I can ask people, but probably no one knows about 80 years back. So what do you do if there are 3 different sources all saying different things?
Well, there's several different things. Usually I've seen that they're saying different things about that are complements, like you're talking about. It's like, that elephant.
For example, in this case,
is it actually direct conflict? Go ahead.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, in this case, it's about why a specific business model was started. It was wartime, so there was propaganda, and you need to find what was really the truth behind what was said. So that's
okay. Then maybe what you do is you distinguish between, I don't know, what the source was. So if this is, I don't know, I'm looking at your name, so I think, well, maybe this is Germany. So maybe the Germans in you know, the German government was saying one thing, but other people were saying something else. So you simply present both perspectives.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Emma?
Hi, thank you. I actually want to go back to a slide you just had up before, this rigor and quality slide, where you talked about controversies and surprises. And I wonder if you could speak briefly about this coding debate, because I'm a qualitative research and I don't really like coding and I don't find it that helpful. And I'm interested to hear more about the debate and the sort of alternatives that you see.
Yeah, there's the coding. I mean, I think what a lot of people are
go back to the slide you just had.
Got their dog on, I think. I'm not sure who that is. Yeah.
About controversies and surprises. And I wonder if you could speak briefly about this coding debate.
I think I'm talking. I think I was talking to Anna.
I'm not sure what's going on.
Maybe everybody go on mute and I'll talk. Yeah, yeah, something was going on there. Anyway, to the answer, I think this was Anna's question about she doesn't really like coding, and what's the coding debate? I think there's a lot of thinking about that you need to, if you read some articles, certainly when you read submissions, when I'm doing reviewing, I'll see this sort of endless kind of 2, 3, 4 pages about we coded this way and then next we coded that way and that way and that way, and I think it's fine to write that, but if you only have 40 pages, I don't think you want to spend your time too much about that, and rather show the outcome of, what I think is important is the outcome of the coding. You know, what did the data look like that are supporting whatever the construct is of the second order theme? What are the data and how exactly you did the coding, and, you know, your struggles and what worked and what didn't is, to me, not interesting. Or if you had 200 pages, I might be interested, but in 40 pages, I'm not. So I think it's, you know, I think it's more important to certainly describe what you did, but keep it brief and really show the data and show how the data fit whatever theme or construct you're coming up with. So that's where I am on that one. But I'm not, you know, I may be an outlier on that, but I think that's more realistic and more useful. Maybe go to the next person, if that's okay, Anna. We'll move over to Crystal.
First, thank you for your presentation and the insights. And my question is like how to theorize when there are too many variants, and
how to theorize when? Say the question again.
Too many variants, like there's too many ways to compare with the multiple cases. Because my research is focused on the new venture board dynamic and like how board directors interaction with each other and how these interactions shape decision making and that affect the venture performance. So
right,
I know that's a big question. So when I
there's two things I'd say. One is I think you want a narrower variable than venture performance. So because venture performance is being driven by lots of things. Only one of which would be board interaction. So I would have a narrower measure of the effectiveness of the board than just venture performance. The second thing is, you know, I think you have, you know, focus on some aspect of the board, you know, like how they've, like when Sam did, he looked at the strategic, how the board worked in terms of strategic decision making, and he sort of didn't look at other things like the comp committee or audit or whatever. He didn't look at those things. He just looked at strategic decision making. And so I think if you narrow what the board is looking at, if you have an outcome variable that is more precise, and then if you raise your level of distraction to higher levels, you'll come out with something simpler.
Sorry, just the other way. The follow-up question is like, because now I'm trying to collect my multiple cases by using this, for example, one VC form with the 2 portfolios, and the VC form will be in different ownership. Like I'm trying to compare different owner, like how this ownership impacts this.
How ownership? Well, then you're starting to ask a question that's better answered with an econometric study.
Yeah, that's my original idea, because before I was tend to do the quant research, and then my mind supervisor suggests you can start with a pilot study with a qualitative to identify your variables. And then at the end, I don't know how to, because my whole logic design is how to test different variables and by using modeling. Like,
oh,
so
I see.
I don't know
yeah.
how to start like theorizing now.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I mean, a lot of good deductive research starts with qualitative interviews, but then moves on. So perhaps that's the answer.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Well, good luck with it. Yeah. I can probably take maybe 2 more questions, and then I have to go, unfortunately. But or maybe three. So maybe Kamala one.
Hello.
I'm just kind of going in the order that's appearing to me.
Hi. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Kathy. I would like to ask in terms of how can we actually build theory? And then in that sense, I would like to ask that. Let's say I would like to borrow the concept from another field and then use it to answer my research question. But then that particular concept was actually looking at a different level of analysis. So let's say they were looking at individual level, but then my research question were aiming to explore at the firm level. Would that be an issue?
Well, you first of all, you wouldn't start a theory building study with a construct that you already had. So you wouldn't begin with a construct. That would be more of a theory testing thing that you'd be doing. Maybe theory elaboration. So you wouldn't typically start with you wouldn't start with the answer, because theory building from cases, you don't start with an answer, and you're starting with an answer. So you wouldn't do that. That said, you certainly can use a construct from another field. Like you see something that's at the individual level and you're at the firm level, you could certainly pull that construct over, or at least in theory you could, but that would be emergent from your analysis, not something you began with. So you wouldn't begin with a construct, but you could, in fact, like we've used, typically I'll probably the most frequent discipline that I will pull from is cognitive science. So I might be looking at teams, but I'm actually pulling out an individual level cognitive science construct. So you can switch around the levels.
Right. Yeah, but
the really more fundamental point is you don't start with a construct.
Sure, but then let me kind of ask you that from your paper with McDonald, right, that you used the concept of parallel play, but then but that, I mean, I really loved that paper and I got inspired with it. Yeah, but at the same time, I had a question that you kind of bring out the concept of parallel play from, like child and education, that sort of thing. But then at the same time, you built up your immersion theory. So in that sense, I was kind of wondering how it sits between, like the difference between theory building and theory elaboration. Yeah. Because
Well, I'll tell you what we did. I mean, this is a paper for those of you who are on the call but don't know this paper. We were looking at how do entrepreneurs design business models, and as we started seeing the theory and the theory emerged, we saw that in fact the concept of competition didn't make a lot of sense, and what people were actually doing was borrowing from their peers and imitating their peers. And then we started to see some other things. And then it occurred to us, I think because Rory had little kids and I used to have little kids, we said, wait a minute, that's what little kids do. So the emergent theory was coming out of the cases, and then we realized, oh, that looks like little kids. So the little kids parallel play came later. And then once we saw, oh, that's a lot like parallel play, let's read about parallel play and see the degree to which our data looks even more like parallel play. So we know parallel play at a fairly casual level. So then we read more about parallel play, and we started to realize that our data were in fact looked a lot like parallel play. But we didn't start with parallel play. That came out of, we had our emergent theory and we noticed the similarity to parallel play. And then we took advantage of that similarity to then dig deeper into ways in which our data were like parallel play. And then we thought about, why would it be that entrepreneurs designing business models would look like 4-year-olds? And we started to realize, oh, what's the same about 4-year-old and an entrepreneur? 4-year-old is discovering the world. Entrepreneurs in a new market are discovering the world. And so that was why a 4-year-old could look like an entrepreneur. But we didn't start with parallel play.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That's answered a lot of all this confusion. Yeah, thanks again.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, Kiran?
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It's like been a little bit, several aha moments along the way. But okay, so thank you. So I have a research which consists of 14 case studies. You mentioned earlier in your talk that for research to be considered as theory building case study, you need multiple sources of data. I work with family businesses and family firms. So typically, other than interviews, family firms are notoriously shy with sharing other, I mean, even telling you about financials, etc. You have to often use proxies for financials, performance, and so on and so forth. Now, if my question is, if I have multiple sources of data, like multiple stakeholders, but they're all qualitative interviews. Okay, they're all qualitative interviews, but multiple stakeholders within the same case. So 14 cases, 5 qualitative interviews per case, all with every interviewee having a very unique perspective. Somebody being a predecessor, somebody being a successor, someone being an employee, someone being a non-family. So could that be considered as multiple sources of data?
Sure. I think that would. Yeah, I mean, just in thinking of your study, I would say you'd probably be better off with fewer cases and more informants.
Well, the data collection part is over. I can't go back out now.
All right, so that is what it is. Yeah, yes, I would say that if you're like, you talk to the brother and you talk to the father and you talk to the sister, you talk to the uncle. I think that's, yes, I think the degree to which you talk to many people is advantageous. So I think you're fine. A paper you might look at is Lee and Pazunka in ASQ.
Sorry, what's the name of the paper?
LI and Henning Pazunka. It's an ASQ 2020, and it's on Chinese family firms. So you might find the way in which they use the data from Chinese family firms. I'm guessing maybe your family firms are Indian or something. They're not Chinese.
Yes, yes.
But you would have the data collection would be very similar. So you might take a look at a really good case study article that's about family firms.
Okay, could you give me the last name again?
It's Pazunka, Piezunka, and it's ASQ. I think it's 2020.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah. Good luck with it. Yeah, family firms are very under-researched. Very cool. Let me take one last question, maybe Nita, although Jan, I can actually see you, so I should probably take your question. Nita, are you there?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor. So my question is, how do we justify our choice, whether we use a cross-case analysis or a longitudinal study? Just to explain the context, I'm conducting a multiple case of a new ventures which have a different gender diversity ratio and how it could influence their innovation performance. But what I found after the interview is that gender diversity ratio is quite changing over time because of the turnover, because the new ventures is very dynamic. So the question is, how do we justify our choice, whether it's a cross case or a longitudinal study?
I mean, I think you have to look at what you have. I mean, if you want to talk about the case at a single point in time, where each case has a ratio at that point in time, you could do that. Like if you look, I'll give you. If you look back at my old paper on fast decision making, that's essentially a cross-sectional case. So look at how I did that, and if that's the data you have, that's the data you write. If you do have something over time, and you're saying something about how the changing ratio influenced something, then you'd want to have a longitudinal study. But it really depends on what your data are. I don't think you have to justify it either way. It's more you have data and they are what they are, and it's either better told as a cross-sectional story or better told as a longitudinal study. It's more common to be a longitudinal study, but you could certainly tell it cross-sectionally, depending on what your data were. Okay. But that old paper will show you how to do a cross-sectional one.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, why don't we make Jan the last question, and then I'm sorry, I've got another commitment, I gotta take off, but Jan, why don't you go for it?
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I already started data collection. I am doing multiple case study, and my challenge is that after some, so my cases were very open to give me some data at the beginning, but now I struggle to get more data, especially interviews. So my question is, how do you incentivize companies to participate in multiple case studies, especially because I'm noticing that what they are most interested in is some kind of like consulting along the way if I make interesting observations and can comment on them, or maybe even share from other cases. And of course, I can't really do that because then I get too big of an influence in my own study. So yeah, how do you incentivize cases?
How do you incentivize? I mean, you could cry, you could
try that.
You could beg. No, I mean, how do you incentivize? I mean, I think it's okay to give them consulting. I think one of the reasons that people participate in studies is they want to know what they're doing and they want to know how it compares to someone else. And I think you can legitimately do that if you want to. It takes time for you. In my experience, the companies or the executives who want to do that are typically the better executives. They're more interested and more proactive in their learning. But as long as it isn't sort of, or you can promise them that in the future, if you feel that if you did that now, it would change your data. So if you think it would sort of take your data to give them tips now, you say, well, give me this one more interview and then I'll be able to have a full range of data, and I'll really be able to give you a much richer understanding of yourself, and I'll compare you with other people and whatever. So I would go, if that's what they want, that's what you give them. You may want to time it for later so you don't taint the data.
Okay, and would you indicate that then in the paper?
No, because I don't see that you did anything. I mean, it's the fact that you gave people after the study feedback on their performance, I don't think has anything to do with the paper.
Okay.
Cool. And it's fairly common. I mean, I don't think people reveal it, but I don't think it's a secret either. You've only got, you can't tell everything in a paper. You got to kind of pick and choose.
Sure. Cool.
Okay, yeah. Well, good luck with it, Jan.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry I can't get to the rest of you. I both have a concussion and can only stay online for so long, and I've got another commitment. But I do want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I hope it was worth your time. And I'm sorry that I know there's Shika and Gio Lorenzo and a bunch of other people there. I'm sorry I can't get to you. But thank you, and I do hope it was worth your time. So thanks a lot, and have a great day.